Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon for those who are on different time zones. I am Ziad Ayoubi, the head of the Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Unit in UNHCR headquarters, Geneva. We would like to welcome you and introduce you to today's webinar titled Seeking Economic Inclusion for Refugees, a case study of the graduation approach in Ecuador. This webinar is organized by the Social Protection for Employment community, a community of practice that you can find on www.socialprotection.org. The Social Protection for Employment community is established and supported by the German Development Cooperation. It's an initiative implemented by GIZ and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. The Social Protection for Employment community has organized a series of webinars on linking social protection and sustainable employment programs, employing a practical country case approach to showcase the concept. So based on today's webinar, we will be exploring the interest coming from participants to organize potential and future webinars in collaboration with our partners and with SPEC based on case studies around economic inclusion for refugees. Today, in today's webinar, we will be listening to three different presenters. The first presenter will be Alexi Bernagros. She's the Director of Technical Assistance in Trickle NGO. Alexi will be talking about the graduation approach in a generic point of view, plus introducing the inclusiveness of refugees in this poverty alleviation approach. Sabrina Lustgarten from HIAS, who's the National Director of HIAS Ecuador, will be talking about the inclusion of refugees in Ecuador in this specific program and the opportunities and challenges that were faced in this specific case. Maria Alicia Eguiguren, who is the Durable Solutions Officer in UNHCR Ecuador, will also be complementing what Sabrina will be presenting from a UNHCR point of view. At the end, we will have the opportunity to discuss with Rachel Sabates-Wheeler, a professor in the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, and James Canonge, Social Protection Department in ILO. We will have the opportunity to discuss with those two discussants the content of the presentations. Participants will have the chance to pose questions on the chat at any time, and we will try to answer the questions, and if not, we will be able to pose our answers on the website after the webinar. So during the webinar also, we will be posing two poll questions, and we will invite you as participants to provide your answers. And we will tackle these answers during the presentations provided by the three presenters today. So thank you a lot for joining us again. And let me start with a broad introduction about the refugee economic inclusion from a UNHCR point of view. We will start, before going into the details, with the first poll question, and we would like to ask you, from your point of view, what is the most important to promote economic inclusion of refugees? You have a number of answers. Can you please choose what applies in your opinion? Obviously, organizers and panelists will not vote, so we will be waiting for you as participants to vote, to choose. why it is important to promote economic inclusion of refugees. Options are for human rights, to achieve economies of scale, improving social cohesion, achieve efficiency, or bringing diversity to many areas. I can see that around 41% of participants already voted. We have 61% votes already. %70% will give you a few seconds more. %79%. Now we can close the votes. Thank you for taking the time. As you see, we have majority voted for human rights. Obviously, you chose that achieving economic inclusion of refugees is a human right. To achieve economies of scale took 25%. Improving social cohesion ranked second, 71%. Efficiency and bringing diversity ranked least, 21%. So majority of you consider achieving economic inclusion as a vehicle to achieve human rights and to improve the social cohesion. We fully agree on this approach. I will move to the next slide and explain how in UNHCR we look at economic inclusion and how we're trying to make a difference in this area. Maybe a quick historical introduction in the humanitarian setup. Let's say humanitarian organizations, including UNHCR, have been always trying to achieve economic inclusion and improve livelihoods of people. However, in the previous eras, maybe we were looking at it from more the supply side, and we were trying to improve people's lives by providing training, vocational training, and supply type of interventions, while currently, most of the humanitarian organizations, including UNHCR, is more looking at how to achieve market-oriented interventions and how to take into consideration the market systems when we look at the economic inclusion of refugees. So, practically speaking, we are not looking only at the capital of the people and the human development side. We're looking also at challenges. We're looking at what type of support functions people can access, what type of rules and regulations are governing the market systems, and what should be done in terms of interventions to provide access to people to national systems in order to achieve positive outcomes. Obviously, this direction is more comprehensive. It looks more at market systems rather than looking at individual elements in the market systems. Next. So inclusiveness is key to achieve economic inclusion. Avoiding creating parallel system is one of the most important changes that we are applying in our UNHCR strategy on livelihoods and economic inclusion. As I said, in the past, we used to provide services and implement ourselves some livelihoods interventions. while now we are more focusing on conducting institutional mappings, making sure that we understand very well the national systems and the market systems, and trying to include people in national systems instead of creating parallel ones. This requires some capacity development and investments in the national systems, which means that we are trying to attract additional development funding and not necessarily humanitarian funding in order to develop the national systems to absorb refugees and other displaced people. So in ensuring that people are receiving quality services, but in line with standards at the national level is very important also. So inclusiveness avoids creating tension because of the inconsistency of the level of services between nationals and refugee populations. Inclusiveness is definitely one of the most important vehicles and ways to avoid social tension, and including people in systems, avoid having negative coping mechanisms, including radicalism and other ways of negative livelihoods strategies. What we know from our field experience is that bringing diversity and richness is one of the results of inclusiveness. We've heard a lot of private sector companies, multinational corporates, saying that when they included refugees in their workforce, they achieved better productivity, and they diversified their cultural environment in the workplace. Achieving economy of scale, definitely, instead of excluding a whole population in the host country, including this population will lead to better productivity, to efficiency and economy of scale. And finally, what you all said in your answers, complying with the human rights conventions, even in the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which is the basics for human rights values in the world. Everyone has the right to work, and refugees are included in this. Next. One of the ways to include refugees in economies was to look at the graduation approach as a poverty alleviation program. Our presenters will go into the details about this approach and what are the different components of this approach. However, I will speak a little bit why UNHCR decided to look at the graduation approach and to try to include refugees in it. First of all, it's obvious that most of the refugee operations are protracted and people need to be included in economies. However, some of them are vulnerable and poor, and they need a certain way to be included in economy, and they don't have enough viability to integrate, and they need some additional and comprehensive support. So this is one of the reasons why graduation as a careful approach was suitable for the refugee population. The sequencing in the approach and the specialization in poor populations was relevant to refugee populations because, as you know, because of the displacement trauma, some people fall into poverty even though they were not poor in their country of origin, and this ultra poverty element requires a special attention. Finally, some of the components of the graduation, and this will be explained later on by Alexi maybe, some of the components are actually existing in humanitarian operations and are part of the protection operations. This includes case management, cash assistance, and other things. So this is an element to be built on while including people in displacement in the graduation approach. Finally, we decided to work on graduation in order to prove that this is a model that can work for refugees, and to invite development actors to scale up and to make sure that in social protection programs at the national level, refugee always have a place from an inclusiveness point of view and from a development also point of view. I will hand over now to Alexi to continue speaking about the graduation from a broader lens. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ziad. If we can go ahead to the next slide. So, as Ziad mentioned, my name is Alexi Bernagros. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance for Trickle Up. We focus on economic strengthening programs for vulnerable populations. We're based in New York and have regional offices in Guatemala, in India, and in Burkina Faso. And we've been around for about 40 years and have traditionally implemented a lot of the pieces of what's known as the graduation approach directly. And in the last few years, as noted on the previous slide, we've begun to work with large institutions and organizations such as UNHCR to provide technical support and guidance for the design and implementation of the graduation approach specifically for vulnerable populations. So with UNHCR, obviously focusing on work with refugees, but more broadly also working with municipal governments to integrate indigenous populations or people with disabilities into existing social protection or social safety nets, etc. My understanding is that folks already do have a sense of the graduation approach, so I'm going to go ahead and ask for our second poll before we go into the nitty-gritty on the graduation approach and specifically how we have been working with UNHCR to adapt the graduation approach for refugees. So, building on your existing experience and kind of thoughts around the graduation approach and livelihoods, which of the following components do you think are the most important to build self-reliance and sustainable livelihoods? We have coaching, savings, consumption support, asset transfer, livelihood planning. All right, we see numbers coming in. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Get your votes in. All right, and perhaps polls can close. What's our tally? All right, tied for first place, coaching and livelihoods planning. Not far behind, we have savings and asset transfer. And then coming in third, but still with a good number of votes, consumption support. Great, and this shows we're in good hands. It sets us up for a good conversation. A little bit of a trick question. Obviously, all of these components are part of the graduation methodology. You know, and so the argument being that one can't happen without the other, but I think we're spot on in terms, certainly in terms of coaching, distinguishing the graduation approach a bit more from other traditional livelihoods programs. We can go back to the previous slide with the definition of the graduation approach. So the graduation approach is a sequenced and time-bound intervention that aims to help people living in extreme poverty build resilience and engage in sustainable livelihoods. And within that definition, we have three pieces that I'd like to highlight. First, sequenced and time-bound, right? So within the graduation approach, we're talking about a set of intentionally sequenced interventions that help to, or aim to graduate participants out of poverty in a set amount of time. Often, there are about 5 to 8 interventions, depending on the methodology. We're going to talk about 8 specific interventions that are generally offered over the course of 18 to 36 months. So we have coaching, which we mentioned previously, network engagement, savings, which is also mentioned in that poll, consumption support, capacity building, both core capacity building as well as technical skills training, the development of a livelihoods roadmap, and then generally an asset transfer, though in the case of wage employment opportunities, which we'll touch on a little bit in the Ecuador case study, also job support. All right. The second piece that really stands out around the graduation approach specifically is that it is designed specifically for people living in extreme poverty. That definition, maybe we'll use World Bank's definition. Often we will end up using national definitions of poverty or extreme poverty in the refugee context, maybe the minimum expenditure basket. But a way that I like to think about it is, who are these populations who require all 8 of those components in order to successfully engage in livelihood opportunities? If they can just get an asset transfer, just a little bit of additional capacity building, that might not be our demographic, right? And then third, the graduation approach is livelihoods focused. The goal of the approach is for each household to engage in sustainable livelihoods and be resilient to shocks, right? So it's holistic, particularly when we're talking about working in the refugee context, protection concerns, but we do always want to keep that livelihoods lens. Go to the next slide. So a little bit about the graduation approach. Part of what makes the graduation approach so exciting is that it has been tested rigorously through randomized control trials in multiple countries in different types of contexts, implemented by NGOs, financial service providers, governments. If we can press the first button, we see that graduation approach was born of BRAC in Bangladesh in about 2002. There were a lot of promising practices, and if we click to the next one, we see that CGAP and Ford Foundation took note of BRAC's successes, and between 2006 and 2014 funded 10 pilots in 8 countries, a number of which underwent randomized control trials, 6 of them. The RCT showed positive, statistically significant positive impact on social and economic indicators. And in response, with the next button, we see that NGOs started taking hold of this methodology, right, and starting to expand worldwide. We know of at least 30 NGO implemented graduation projects since 2010. Continuing success, donors started to get interested. If we click again, we see that there have been more than 10 donor-supported programs since 2013, and UNHCR is a good number of those. And then, I think most excitingly, governments started to be inspired by this. And if we do our final click, we see that since 2013 or so, we have more than 30 government funded and implemented programs around the globe. So this is really gaining a lot of traction globally, and again, implemented everywhere by all different players. If we move to the next slide, what we'll be focusing on in this conversation is some of the adaptations for refugees. So Trickle and UNHCR began partnering in the early 2012, 2013 or so. started piloting the approach with in Ecuador, Egypt, and Costa Rica, so mostly urban settings, which in and of itself is also innovative, so working both in refugee settings for the first time as well as urban settings, and then started to expand from there. We're now partnering in 9 operations, Latin America and Africa and the Middle East. Most of the more recent pilots, as you'll see, are in rural camp settings. So we're getting a lot of lessons learned about where does this methodology work, and what needs to shift in order to make it successful with refugees, but within the different contexts that refugees are working. Next slide. Right. We're not going to go into a ton of depth, and again, this is assuming that hope most of you understand the basics of the graduation approach. But I wanted to use this slide to highlight a few of the lessons learned that UNHCR and Trickle Up have come across, kind of sound, promising practices for adapting the graduation approach to work with refugees, really across the board. First, starting with targeting. One is we don't want to recreate the wheel, right? We always want to leverage whatever poverty targeting guidelines and processes already exist, be they UNHCR's, the host communities. We want to work with those. In addition, as we think about targeting with refugees specifically and working with UNHCR as an implementing partner, we've noticed it's been important to think not only to help UNHCR expand beyond vulnerability targeting and really focus on that extreme poor, right? So distinguishing between those who have socioeconomic differences. As shown on the slide, on the screen currently, the first component of the graduation approach is coaching. Something that we've learned, and again, this is a component that goes throughout from the beginning of a graduation intervention through the end. Fairly standard, making weekly, bi-weekly household visits, as with most traditional graduation approaches. Something that we've learned in the refugee context is that it really adds value to hire refugees as coaches when possible. If we can't hire refugees, then often our programs have used outreach volunteers who live in the communities, who are familiar and know the communities, who then can act as a support to coaches. Something that the Ecuador operation will speak about, or HIAS will speak about as well, is understanding that many of the refugees with whom we are working have psychosocial needs as well, and so often coaching really has a focus on linkages to psychosocial, more social work, case management referrals as well, which you may not see as frequently in traditional graduation programs. If we click again, we see the next component outlined is savings. As with traditional graduation approach, certainly as implemented by Trickle Up, in camp and settlement locations, village savings and loan associations, informal savings mechanisms still tend to be our preferred modality for encouraging savings. However, as we started to work in urban settings for the first time, we found that VSLAs didn't work as well as they had in some other contexts. The distance between participants was quite far, and so coming together on a weekly basis was challenging, and there was a large amount of distrust between refugee participants that was not conducive to engaging in group solidarity. So instead, in some of our urban contexts, we've started to look for linkages to more formal financial service providers. That still has a number of challenges in many contexts, particularly related to refugees' documentations. Something as simple as, do the number of numbers in your ID card line up with a national ID? Can you actually input it into a bank system, as well as, in some cases, legal rights to a savings account, etc. If we click again, the next component that we talk about in the refugee context is network engagement. This is a new component that we developed with UNHCR for the urban refugee context, where VSLAs were not being used. As we started to implement, still doing savings, but without VSLAs, we noticed that something was missing in the graduation approach, and it was that social cohesion that traditional participants so often gain in through informal savings groups. Without them, it was at a loss. So instead, we've said, hey, let's not let ourselves forget about this. We created a new component called network engagement, where we're intentionally looking for ways to help participants engage with refugees, host community members, maybe via church, women's groups, cultural groups, fairly flexible there. All right, but we're important that we don't forget that in spite of not having a savings group. If we click again, we next see consumption support. This is another place where, particularly in the UNHCR refugee setting, we want to leverage existing cash assistance or social protection programs. Often WFP is already offering some sort of consumption support, be it cash, food vouchers, maybe community gardens, to our participants. So instead of recreating the wheel, again, we want to leverage that. That being said, we also want to take a critical eye to what is being offered, when and why, and sometimes have to top up the existing support to meet consumption needs without, always being aware of not creating a cycle of dependence. You'll note that this component is shorter. Usually it is time bound, usually between 2 to 12 months. In some cases, maybe just during a lean season. So that will be really context specific. The next component that we'll see, if we click again, is core capacity building. Once again, we have started to distinguish between capacity building as core and technical, in large part just because it helps us construct programs a little bit more clearly. But the way that we think about core capacity building in the refugee context is the context-specific training that was received by all graduation participants. So this is capacity building that everyone will receive regardless of their selected livelihood or income-generating activity. Often that will include household financial management in the refugee context, maybe legal rights and responsibilities, maybe some language training, definitely often includes soft skills training. All right. The next component that we see is the livelihoods roadmap. And this is a bit of an ongoing and all-inclusive component, not a technical term that most of you have probably heard of. We made it up a little bit. But what we wanted to get at here is that every single refugee or graduation participant should be engaged in livelihoods, and those livelihood opportunities have to be based on the market assessment for refugees living in extreme poverty. So it has to be really tailored to our population's need. We're always going to have to work within the confines of the legal framework of the country of operations and refugees' right to work. And we're always wanting to think about how are we growing and thinking about a sustainable livelihoods opportunity, not just getting them to engage in one income generating activity one time, right? And to do that, if we click again, we have some supports. The first is technical skills training. And so after participating in core capacity building, graduation participants will participate in more technical skills training that is linked to their specific income generating activity. This could be a vocational training. This could be, a POP on maize, really getting in the nitty gritty there. Often those are existing trainings, but might require some additional adaptation to make it accessible for our refugee population. And so does the language need to change? Do we need to make courses available in the evenings or on weekends because of other competing priorities? Then last but not least, we have the asset transfer or job support. In traditional graduation, we have traditionally talked a lot about the asset transfer for self-employment participants. Again, linking to, this is the nudge that will really help folks engage in that income generating activity. And then in urban context, starting to look at job support as well. So how are we educating employers and refugees' right to work? Maybe we're providing certification for food handling that is required to get employment in a restaurant, etc. So these are just a couple of the highlighted differences and adaptations that we've started to make as we really think about how do we make the graduation approach more relevant and transferable to refugee populations. And next slide. All right. A couple of key findings from adapting the graduation approach for refugees. We have not conducted rigorous RCTs yet, though we're just starting. I'm actually in Uganda at the moment, and there will be an RCT component here. But we do have some good and baseline, midline, endline data, and we've seen promising results so far. In Ecuador, the program that we'll hear more about, the average household per capita income increased from $66 from $66 to $86 from beginning to end of the program. That brought participants above the poverty threshold in Ecuador. We saw that participants' household access to formal financial institutes increased by 95%. Similarly, we've seen in Egypt, out of about over 3,000 participants, 700 by the end of the program had their own business and kind of a sustained business, and another 636 were working in wage employment. And similarly saw an average increase of income per month. I'll stop there and hand the mic over to my colleague Sabrina to go into a little bit more depth about what do these adaptations look like in practice through a case study in Ecuador implemented by partner HIAS.
Thank you very much, Alexi, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe we can begin with the first slide of our presentation. So we are very pleased to contribute in this webinar, sharing our field experience and lessons learned during the implementation of the graduation approach. Next, please. Maybe to give a context of our country, it is important to highlight that Ecuador welcomes the largest number of refugees in Latin America. 87.5% of them are Colombian citizens, and then we have some Venezuelan citizens and extracontinental. And HIAS is working in 9 locations in the borders and in the center of the country, serving more or less 11,000 people of concern within all the programs that we run in Ecuador. Next slide, please. So we knew that adjusting the graduation approach to refugee context would require a very strong and sustainable strategy. Thus, HIAS developed a case management model which implies joint work of all HIAS areas, livelihoods, psychosocial, and legal orientation, with the main objectives of supporting families to achieve sustainable livelihoods. This case management approach addresses the vulnerabilities that the refugee populations face as consequences for displacement, such as trauma experiences and local integration difficulties. Moreover, considering that the cases present specific needs, including extreme poverty, this type of assistance also responds to the particular needs of each family. A core element of the case management approach is the continuous monitoring carried out every 15 days by coaches in order to assess the family's progress and work together on their strategies to achieve the graduation criteria. Community resource staff that is doing the work in the community facilitate the local integration and community networks. The consumption support is provided according to the size of the family during the year, including food assistance, support, nutrition training, and how to eat in an adequate way. Providing consumption support is a key element that allows to focus on building stability and scaling towards economic independence while their most urgent needs are met. Working in these areas, also the Livelihoods area conducts a profile scan of the economically active members of each family. Depending on the results, they will receive orientation and strengthen their abilities to access wage employment or self-employment. These processes include the delivery of seed capital and vocational training to promote sustainability. It is important to note that families also participate in a financial education training that promotes a savings culture and instills financial discipline. As Alexi mentioned, the emotional effects of the forced displacement in some cases require individual and family psychosocial support, which is essential to help them overcome the effects of violence and progress towards graduation. Families also receive legal orientation on their rights and documentation procedure, and cases that require specialized legal assistance are referred to legal partner agencies and the Public Defender's Office. Next slide, please. Our first experience on the implementation of the graduation approach was the pilot project carried out in Santo Domingo, a small peri-urban Ecuadorian city. The pilot officially began on January 2015 with 200 families, including 140 Colombian and 60 Ecuadorians. It's important to mention that this was only in the pilot, the inclusion of the Ecuadorian families. In the scale up, we only serve refugee families. In total, 135 families completed the program in 2016, and 97 of them successfully graduated, which means a 72% graduation rate. The implementation of graduation pilot was the result of coordinated joint work between UNHCR, Trickle, HIAS, and the Workforce Program. And also, we have to mention the private sector, that in this case was the largest bank in the country, the Banco Pichincha, and its subsidiary foundation, CRISFE. UNHCR, Trickle, and HIAS joined efforts to adapt the graduation approach to refugee context and provide technical assistance for its implementation in Ecuador. HIAS became the main implementing organization as we were in charge of providing all the direct assistance and support to the families. Also, the Workforce Program played a key role regarding consumption support with the provision of food vouchers during the first 6 months of the program, and conducted nutrition training processes with the families to improve their eating habits. Considering the promoting of savings culture is important to strengthen the family capacity to overcome shocks. HIAS and UNHCR partnered with CRISFE to implement a financial training process for the participating families so they could improve their income management and prioritize savings. It is important to highlight that the pilot did not include cash consumption support as we have now in the scale-up model. but food support and referrals to public services. Specific and limited cash support was provided only in special circumstances according to the needs of each family. In addition, the families developed their livelihoods without the amount we provide as seed capital. They did only with the micro grants for entrepreneurship that the value was low. Some families did not finish the process due to several reasons, such as resettlement or their decision of returning to Colombia or moving to other cities. However, they achieved 3 to 4 graduation goals, which show that they gained tools to integrate in their new context. The complete pilot process took 2 years, and midterm and final evaluation were conducted in coordination with UNHCR to assess the process and difficulties of each family. In general, we observed that the majority of families overcame extreme poverty and are in better conditions. Next slide, please. As a result of a pilot, we gathered several important results that were taken into consideration for the scale-up, but we would like to emphasize the following. Higher average household monthly income, as Alexi mentioned, improved perception of food security. Food security has been critical to ensure graduation out of extreme poverty and vulnerability. We also found that perceptions of food sufficiency and security are critical for a person's psychosocial well-being and confidence. A question that determines economic decision is, do I have enough food over the week? Thus, providing families with food support enabled them to focus on the development of their livelihoods. While this urgent need was satisfied, families were able to plan how to invest their income and prioritize savings, and they did not have to worry about having enough money to eat. The third point, investment in household assets. A particular characteristic of the graduation approach is that there is an important number of households that prefer to invest a percentage of their income in purchasing household assets. Then, improved self-esteem as a result of community networks. Active participation in community events or groups is directly related with improved self-esteem. When families are able to develop friendship and support networks with the host community and other refugees, they feel more integrated. But not everything has really been easy in this program. 2 of the most important difficulties faced by families with the pilot were few opportunities for formal employment. Like many developing countries, the economy of Ecuador is mainly driven by its informal sectors, and formal employment opportunities are limited. And the prevalence of SGBV. During the implementation of the pilot, we detected very high levels of gender-based violence among the participating families. Gender-based violence does not allow all the women to reach their economic potential and therefore impedes the achievement of sustainable livelihoods. Next, please. After analyzing the implementation of the pilot, UNHCR in coordination with HIAS decided to implement the graduation model approach at a national scale in April 2016. The joint, I want to mention specifically the joint national rollout meetings held by UNHCR, HIAS, and World Food Program since the beginning of the program have been one of the most important tools of the scale-up process. These meetings are conducted with the objective of improving the implementation of the program and also addressing difficulties in the process. This joint work has resulted in the development of tools for the targeting and monitoring processes, as well as tools for the measurement of graduation criteria. Next slide, please. Some of the actions in the scaling up process of the graduation model approach required improving the improvement tool of tools mentioned before, And in this regard, HIAS is strengthening its database system for the management of the case information, that this is crucial and important, which allowed us to keep tracking the family's progress. Moreover, considering that targeting is a continuous key process that ensures that only the most vulnerable families become part of the program, in coordination with UNHCR and World Food Programme, we carry out a process to improve the targeting criteria. As you can see on the slide, these are the profiles prioritized for the process. The trainings to staff has been also a key for this process, for all the staff of the organization that follows the cases. And community work allows us to support cases that do not reach our offices and create networks of support within the communities. Next slide, please. HIAS identified the need for increased advocacy with the private sector to promote the economic inclusion of refugee population. One of the key features of the graduation model approach in Ecuador is its focus on access to adequate wage employment, as it promotes income stability, access to social security services, and local integration. Thus, HIAS has strengthened its corporate social responsibility strategies to promote labor inclusion of refugees. Refugees who have suitable profile for wage employment also receive vocational training to improve their opportunities of being hired. Next slide, please. Regarding sustainability, the graduation model approach promotes access to financial services as an essential element for a better management of savings and the business or household budget. In order to enhance the sustainability of entrepreneurship, HIAS has implemented an entrepreneurship school program that provides the families with accompaniment during the complete development of the business plan, taking into consideration the information gathered in the market analysis, very important in this process, that the livelihoods area carries out periodically to identify the market needs. Next, please. Once in the scale up, we identify the following important challenges. The long processes to obtain the refugee status. In this regard, HIAS works providing legal orientation and referring cases to legal partners and government agencies. Also, discrimination was a challenge, and HIAS has worked to strengthen community work, also in schools, workshop with government institution staff, and integration fairs. In relation to the economic context, and due to the earthquake that Ecuador suffers in 2016, HIAS has worked on orientation for the diversification of income sources, market assessment, and advocacy with the public and private sectors to foster employment for refugees, as well to facilitate the formalization of the entrepreneurships. Promoting a savings culture has required intensive work as part of the financial training process, and coaches have emphasized in its importance during their monitoring visits. Given that the majority of the cases we work with are female headed of households, it is necessary to work on their economic empowerment and provide them with a strategy to overcome gender-based violence situations. Next, please. Implementing the graduation model approach has been a complex process, but there are some key lessons that have helped us provide a comprehensive assistance. The design of the graduation model approach has focused on refugee population and their needs. taking into account the psychological, economic, and social effects of forced displacement. Another of the lessons learned is the importance of the clarity of the messages transmitted to the families in terms of the graduation criteria, process timing, follow-up condition, as well as the fulfillment of the agreements reached to meet the graduation goal with a limited time. In this regard, we developed communication material, as you can see in the slide, to help families monitor their progress towards graduation visually and register the consumption support they receive each month. The comprehensive work from all the areas and the mainstreaming of psychosocial support have made a difference in the progress of families and their commitment with the program. The positive outcome that we have observed after working with private institutions for mutual benefits will result in the continuation of our work in this field. Next, please. Currently, in order to graduate, families must meet the 4 following graduation criteria. Moreover, we also monitor their access to legal documentation and empowerment of rights. Next, please. You can see here a case study of a family graduated in Ecuador. You can read there the profile of the family, and this is one of the examples of a successfully graduated case is the story of Eva. She arrived to Quito, Ecuador in September 2015 with her 3 children and her brother. Here you can see the initial characteristic when the family began the program in June 2016. In this case, the coaches conducted monitoring every 15 days. The family received consumption support, training on entrepreneurship, and a specific business plan was developed for Eva, considering her profile as a pet groomer. In addition, she received orientation for accessing education for her children, and psychological support was provided since she was a survivor of torture. Eva and her family are currently asylum seekers. Considering that the targeting process of family in the graduation approach in Ecuador is conducted on a daily basis, and we identify profiles suitable for the program, so far 231 families that began their process in 2016 have successfully graduated, achieving the 4 graduation criteria and improving the life condition. As time goes by, more families will complete their 18 accompaniment process and will graduate on a daily basis. Thank you very much. And Maria Alicia.
Thank you, Sabrina. And just a couple of slides to complement on Sabrina's presentation. We can move to the next slide, please. Where I'm going to tell you about a third moment or a third stage that the graduation model has reached in Ecuador. And based on our good results and the important evidence from the pilot and the national implementation, now we are starting a pilot project with the Ministry of Social and Economic Inclusion, MIES, which also has a similar program, which is also a cash support program for the most vulnerable families in Ecuador. This program is called the Plan de Acompañamiento Familiar, or Family Support Plan. UNHCR's strategic directions now put more emphasis on encouraging the inclusion of refugees in national systems and not creating parallel programs or systems than what already exists. So the objective of this is to reduce the dependency of refugee families or refugee people on aid, and enabling the progressive realization of the rights and durable solutions in the host community. So to reach this goal, we are, please move to the next slide. we are beginning a pilot project together, HIAS, UNHCR, and HIAS, to include both refugee and Ecuadorian families in a new program that includes the best practices and lessons from both the Plan de Acompañamiento Familiar and the graduation model approach. We will be including 250 families that live in the northern border in the areas where most with a bigger prevalence of extreme poverty. And we will be transferring our best practices and especially the graduation approach to the family support plan to ensure at the end or in a medium-term goal to ensure that refugee families can access Ecuador's social services programs. Next, please. In this last slide, you can see all the components. As Alexi has already shown, I'm not going to stop in. Can you please show all the components? Just click so it shows. And as you can see, the project has been designed in a very similar way to what Alexi has presented. What we are doing is to take what already exists, to have a more inclusive approach of all the components that the government already has, and to strengthen especially all the livelihoods roadmap, which at the moment works as two different services for HIAS. Only families that have an entrepreneurship that has been already designed can access the economic inclusion services at the moment, but what we want is to begin in a more inclusive and integrated approach where all of these components work together. So as we are beginning now, we have targeted our families already, and the next step will be to have some market analysis and building local partnerships to have a more market-oriented intervention. And then we will begin with all the components as it has been explained before. As you can see in yellow, you have what are the most, the stronger components that the national system already has. It is based on the consumption support, which at the moment is not a time-bound component. Families, Ecuadorian families, can keep receiving the consumption support for as long as they need it. In this case, we are trying to emphasize on the importance to leverage this with a stronger livelihoods component where families can reach self-sufficiency and not depend on the support anymore. Family visits will continue. Within family visits, we establish a family plan based on specific needs for each family. Then families also establish their own responsibilities also in this process. And then you have in yellow, which is going to be very important, the reference services to other ministries and programs that already exist, where we need to strengthen alliances. So here we see some barriers for refugee families who cannot access health, education, and other programs where we need to reach with a stronger emphasis. And then, of course, the livelihood roadmap, as Alexi has explained before.
Thanks, Maria Alicia. Thanks, Alexi. Thanks, Sabrina, for the presentations. We still have 26 minutes of time. We will go directly to our discussants to hear from them some feedback on the presentations. But maybe before doing that, I can share with you the first wave of questions that we collected from the participants, so discussants can also take these questions into consideration. Sorry for being selective. I will not be able to reflect all the questions. Maybe I start with the first one on the revalidation of diplomas. And the question is, what are we doing in terms of revalidating diplomas in collaboration with the host governments? And the participant is saying that there is an experience in Brazil, and she's ready to share a report about this experience of revalidating diplomas. So maybe our panelists and discussants can take into consideration this question from Eloa. Second, from Rachel, she's asking, can extreme poor people really start saving and focusing on training before consumption is stabilized through consumption support? Yeah, very valid question. Next, a question to Ziad and Alexi about documenting evidence to convince host countries that refugees could be economically included. And so the question is around building the evidence base around the economic impact of refugees in the host country. We need more examples, we need more evidence, more cases. I believe, to answer shortly this question, I believe many institutions, including the World Bank, Oxford, and many research institutes already worked on that, but we always need more of this type of evidence base. Next is the graduation approach actually relies on the WFP food consumption support. How can we sustain this, and what alternatives are available? Right, the consumption stipend is one of the main elements, and any graduation implementation requires sustainability in the consumption support. Next question, how long do we need to build successful graduation model for refugees? So what's the time requirement? And again, to Alexi, regarding the challenges with the VSLAs, the question is, where the challenges faced on VSLAs not a result of maintaining the same group size across contexts rather than being flexible? So did you apply a flexibility, or you maintained the same size of the groups? From experience, higher group sizes force some members to travel longer distances to meetings, and members will be taking public transport. So it's the whole question is around how can we make VSLA more successful vis-a-vis the number of people in the groups. In some cases, this may force people to take public transport, and the cost to attend meetings become higher. I will stop here and hand over to our discussants. We still have 22 minutes to close this webinar. Over to you, Rachel and James. Rachel, you are muted. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yes. No, somebody had to unmute me. Okay. So hi, I'm Rachel. Sabates-Wheeler. I'm from the Institute of Development Studies, and I'm director of the Center for Social Protection there. And most of my work in the last, say, 15 years has been on looking at social protection in different contexts, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Not necessarily in the refugee context, but looking at graduation programs in more sort of stable development contexts, mainly for citizens. But more recently, I've been looking at shock responsive social protection that includes refugees as well. So thank you very much for your presentations. I'm going to keep this very short. I'll just make a few comments that hopefully will promote some discussion. I think the first question, first issue I'm going to raise is to say, of course, graduation and building resilient livelihoods is a really fundamental vision and aspiration for poor people, for anyone, particularly within social policy and social protection programs. But there are two caveats to that. One is to recognize that some people will never graduate. Some people particularly those, you can think of the elderly or households with high dependency ratios due to disabilities or old age, will need very long-term support. So the issue of time-limited support has to be very specific to a type of household with certain characteristics. So that's the first caveat. The second one is that graduation, the term itself, is often sort of associated with graduating off a program or over a threshold that you define somehow as, this many assets or this much income. And that is actually not equivalent to sustainable and resilient livelihoods, because if you graduate over a threshold and then within a month or so you have a shock to your household or a flood or a drought, whatever kind of shock it is, or conflict, you can immediately go underneath that threshold, and then you should really be straight back on the program. So graduation needs to be thought of as sustainable movements along a trajectory of change, positive change. And so that brings me to my second point, is how do we measure graduation? And we heard from one of the last speakers about how they're doing it in Ecuador. I was involved in evaluating a NGO graduation program in Rwanda that was funded by Concern Worldwide. And it was a 2-year time-limited program. And what we did is that we had a baseline. We looked at all the beneficiaries and a control group as well. Then we looked at them, what they were like at the end of the program. And then we followed them up twice more over 3 years to see what their trajectory of change was like. And what was very clear is that some households never even got to a threshold of any sort of what you would define as resilience in terms of food security and needs and assets. Others were on a very upward positive path. Others looked like they'd graduated, but 2 years later they were taking a real downturn. And when we did some analysis of that, it was clear that there was some obvious factors such as gender, particularly around the makeup of the household, the head of the household, the location effects, depending on whether the location, the local economy was thriving or not, would really influence whether people are able to graduate sustainably. And other things like their initial asset portfolio, if they had a lot of assets or livestock, they were much more likely to be able to use that support to make change. So it's really important that we don't time limit our projects over a whole group of very heterogeneous households. It's really important to think, who is it we're actually looking at here, and how much time and support do they really need? Because obviously not everyone's going to have the same trajectory. And I think generally you could break it down into groups and think about different types of support. So my last point then is around harmonizing refugee types of graduation programs with national programs and how we go about doing that. Of course, it's really important that we're not duplicating efforts, particularly around targeting or doing vulnerability analysis of different groups. It's really important that we share information across these sectors that have historically been very sort of distinct sectors. But of course, harmonization is actually a political economy issue when it comes to refugees. Some governments will welcome, national governments will welcome refugees. Others would not want refugees, and they certainly wouldn't want to recognize them as having any rights to their own social, taxation and social benefits. So there's a real project there around political economy that's very different to just implementing and technological change and implementing programs. It's around influencing agendas politically, and also recognizing that sometimes you're going to need humanitarian principles, which are around neutrality, impartiality, and humanity, that are very different potentially to national government agendas. And so there might always be a case to have separate programs for certain groups that otherwise would potentially be excluded, actually purposely excluded from a program. So they're just things to think about as we take the discussion forward. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Maybe we take from James some observations.
Okay. Hey, thank you. Yeah, really interesting presentation. Thanks to everyone who presented, and to Rachel for her insights. I was sort of, I have like a bunch of disparate points that sort of came up throughout the presentation. I won't be able to get to all of them, but certainly one of them is related to what Rachel was saying. Since we're at socialprotection.org and I'm from the social protection department, I would be remiss if I didn't try to reiterate that I don't think that graduation is a substitute for social protection coverage, which is something that we advocate for at the ILO, that people are covered for different risks that are not only incurred by the poor. Here we're talking about health risks that would be remedied with health insurance for financial protection, risks associated with old age or disability that could be mitigated by pensions, precisely so that people who experience these risks don't fall back into poverty. And so when we hear about the criteria for graduation, when someone is no longer in need of that anti-poverty form of social protection, I'm curious to know, with Alexis's presentation, whether or not in the trial evaluations there is any indication of whether participation in other forms of social protection programs also had any sort of impact on the sustainability of their graduation from poverty thanks to the program. I'm curious to know if there's any information on that. Secondly, looking at the graduation criteria again, this number of meals per day, etc. I'm curious on how the incentives are working for program participants to graduate. At the ILO, we work not necessarily with graduation programs, but we do work with some time-bound assistance, things like unemployment benefits, where someone's receiving a regular monthly payment during the period that they're not working. And the question of incentives is really key when it comes to the design of those programs. You know, an additional day of work has always got to be more lucrative than an additional day of benefits, and it has to be structured in such a way that it creates the right incentives. How is it that, or is there any sense that beneficiaries are ever either underreporting on their successes or are intentionally not achieving certain benchmarks in order to continue benefiting from the cash and other assistance? I'd be curious to know if there's any information on that. And then perhaps more longer term, I know that with this pilot and with discussions about integration of refugees into nationally run programs, I think UNHCR's long-term goal is to sort of progressively disengage from the direct assistance and have the government perhaps take over a larger share of that responsibility. In Ecuador in particular, and those who are in the country will probably know better, but Ecuador, from even a regional perspective across the Americas, has the lowest incidence of child benefits coverage or coverage of vulnerable groups with social assistance compared to any of its neighbors. So I'm curious to know what UNHCR and what the NGO partners see as the necessary support from other, perhaps development actors like the ILO, like the development banks, what support they would need in order to sort of create a synergy where, you know, the government is at the same time taking up responsibility, but also then making the necessary investments to make sure that vulnerable refugees and Ecuadorians alike are covered by these social programs in a sustainable way, and whether or not there are particular needs from development actors and what sort of coordination can be done on the humanitarian side. And then perhaps lastly, I want to maybe say something controversial, or just to see what sort of reaction there could be. You know, the poll said that inclusion was important because it would promote social cohesion, and to a degree, I assume that's true. If one were to play the devil's advocate, though, one could argue that inclusion of refugees into labor markets, into social protection systems, like Rachel alluded to earlier, could bring competition for limited resources in terms of the national revenues, the national social envelope, or competition within the labor market for jobs. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I mean, for us, I think inevitably the downward pressure on wages that could be anticipated from new entrants to the labor market can be mitigated precisely by creating legal pathways to work, where social protection is a part of formal sector work that refugees can participate in. They're contributing, and they're not acting as a source of labor that can be abused by employers, hiring them without social protection, without the proper employment guarantees, or rather the employment protections that would make them a cheaper source of labor, pulling downward on the prevailing wages. So food for thought. Thanks for all the great presentations, and I look forward to the discussion that continues.
Thanks, Rachel and James, for the very important observations you had. One invitation for everybody to join the socialprotection.org website, so you can pose more questions, and we will be answering your questions there on the website. For the moment, I will not be able to share more questions from the chat. Colin, I will invite the panelists to provide some answers to what has been already mentioned by participants and by the discussants. We still have 9 minutes to close, and maybe I can share quickly as a reply to what James mentioned, the issue of social cohesion. I can share our thoughts on that. I think there is a need to measure the direct cost and the short-term cost and the longer-term costs. Definitely, sometimes the perception is that inclusiveness will lead to competition and to scarcity of resources. However, in most of the places, we've seen that excluding people from social systems and from economies led to higher costs at the longer term by deepening social issues and deepening poverty in the host countries, where inclusiveness led to better wins and to higher values at the longer term. And we've seen some examples where refugees were integrated in the host countries and contributed very significantly to the economy. More research is needed, more evidence base needs to be built, and we need to take into consideration differences between contexts. So I partially agree on what you said, but I think more research is really the key answer here. Over to you, panelists, so you can share with us some thoughts about what we heard. You have 7 minutes. I will have to cut you short at some point. Over. Alexi, over to you.
I'm happy to jump in. I'm happy to jump in. A couple of points that I'll jump on. There was a question about, can participants living in extreme poverty focus on savings and training before they're stabilized via consumption support? No, not necessarily. But you'll see if we go back to the visual or around kind of the timing and sequencing of the graduation components. I forgot I can put on my video. You know, we do want consumption support to start at the very beginning, starting those VSLA groups, and what, you know, often we're talking about instilling first a habit of savings, even if it's just a couple of cents each week, maybe out of the consumption support, so that you get into the habit of savings. And then once you have a livelihood activity, starting to focus more on growing those amounts, right? And so you'll see that sequencing, also focusing first on training, the asset transfer, etc., before we really dig down deep. There's a question around the time required to build a successful graduation for refugees programming. It depends a lot on the implementing partner. On average, we say it takes about 9 months to put things in place at a minimum. Obviously, there are many cases where it takes quite a bit longer. We have found that working with UNHCR, aligning operations, kind of ensuring that they have met some of the livelihoods minimum criteria for livelihoods programming, such as having a socioeconomic assessment, having a market analysis in place, can really help us jump ahead. In the cases where we don't have that, we spend a lot of time designing, trying to fill in those questions about what is poverty, what are viable livelihood opportunities. So we do have some good lessons learned in terms of how to think about when will you be ready, so that once you start programming and designing, you're able to really get going a little bit more quickly. Last bit around research. Yes, we need more. There is some good research outside of the refugee context, and we can include a link to the paper published in Science by Innovations Poverty Action. Out of those, the RCTs conducted with CGAP and Ford Foundation, there's some data around costs. On average, graduation in non-refugee situations costs a minimum of $350 per participant in India, up to $2,000+ in some other contexts. They also did a little bit of a cost-benefit analysis, where really in almost every context, then we did see over 100% increase in benefit as compared to those costs. But we need a lot more on refugee context specifically, and that proof in terms of the specific value to the host community. As I mentioned, Food for Peace in Uganda is starting up. We're in the design phase right now of conducting a 7-year 2-cohort RCT that is looking at 3 treatment arms with host community and refugees, and looking forward to having some of that data finally at hand. I'll stop there for now. Sabrina, Maria Alicia.
Thanks, Alexi. So, Sabrina and Maria Alicia, do you have any comment so far?
Yes,
before
we have
closing.
a question regarding SGBB. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, thank you for the question about SGBB. Maybe to clarify why was SGBB on the increase, I have to say that it's not really an increase. What we notice in this process is that with the participation of the coaches following the cases, we identify the cases in a better way. I think this is a very important thing. And the other thing is also we train our staff to have the eye on this kind of risk. So it's the following of the case that we identify better the cases, and also the training of our staff that can identify in a better way. And UNHCR did a study of SGBB in the graduation model approach that maybe will be in another webinar. But really, these they identify in the study that with the graduation model approach, we can first identify better the cases. Second, we identify anteriormente, o sea, in the previously, o sea, más tempranamente, earlier, we can identify this earlier, And we can refer to legal assistance. Also, giving the cash to the woman was a very important point in this study. And also to support to open a bank account in the name of the woman, and to train also in entrepreneurship for a business for the woman. They can really have more strength in their lives. And I don't want to forget the psychosocial support that is given to the families when we identify these kind of cases. So we are really aware of that, and because of this, we put that in the presentation as a part of one of the challenges and how we are working on it.
Thanks a lot for everybody. Thanks for the participants. Thanks for our panelists for contributing to this very important webinar. Thanks for the discussants. I would like to remind everybody that you can continue this conversation and discussion on the socialprotection.org website, where we will be consolidating all your questions and answering them in collaboration with all partners. It seems that there is a high interest in this topic of refugee economic inclusion, and we will be following up with SPEC. In order to explore more topics, as we said, we might go for topics like financial inclusion, specific components of the graduation, things around employment and entrepreneurship policies. So please stay tuned, and we will be informing you about these coming webinars. Special thanks to the SPEC team, February Curry and Fazle Mahmoud, and the socialprotection.org team in Brazil for making this webinar happen. We invite you now to participate in a short survey following this webinar in order to assess and evaluate this specific webinar. And thanks a lot again for joining us. And hopefully we will see you in future webinars on refugee economic inclusion. Thanks a lot.